Good afternoon, everyone. Let us start the webinar. First of all, we apologize for slight delay in starting the webinar. Before we get into the schedule of the webinar, some housekeeping announcements. Please keep your mic muted and video off. If you have any questions to any of the speakers, please type in the chat box. We also are video recording the whole webinar. Once again, good afternoon, good morning, and good evening to all of you, depending upon which time zone you are in. And I'm also extending the greetings of World Environment Day and welcoming all of you to the webinar titled Restoring the Ecosystem, Challenges in the Midst of the Pandemic and the Way Forward. We have about 171 people registered for this webinar from 23 different states in India and 11 different countries from Nigeria to Canada to Zimbabwe to Suriname. We are also live streaming the webinar on YouTube as well. So many of them are watching the webinar on the YouTube. We have 5 prominent speakers in this webinar who will be speaking on various aspects of the theme. A special word of welcome to all of them. I will introduce the speakers one by one later. A little background, as all of you know, the World Environment Day is celebrated on June 5th every year, starting from 1974. In 1972, the first day of the Stockholm conference was first observed as the World Environment Day. Then in 1974, the first day was observed in US with the theme Only One Earth. So thereafter, it is observed every year. So this is the 47th World Environment Day. In 1987, the UN also decided to rotate the host country for the celebration of this day. As many of you know, in 2018, India hosted the World Environment Day on the theme Beat Plastic Pollution. And this year, the day is hosted by Pakistan on the theme Ecosystem Restoration under the campaign Reimagine, Recreate, Restore. Also, this year marks the beginning of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, that is from 2021 to 2030, a global mission to revive millions of hectares from forests to farmlands, from the top mountains to the depth of the sea. The decade unites the world behind a common goal, preventing, halting, and reversing the degradation of ecosystem worldwide. The emergence of COVID-19 pandemic has reminded us how disastrous the consequence of ecosystem loss can be. The environmental degradation is alarming proportions in one of the major threats world is facing today. Various studies also point out that 63 million people could be forced from their homes by 2050 in the South Asia region as rising seas and rivers swallows villages and drought-hit land no longer supports crops. Coming to our own country, the Biennial Environmental Performance Index 2020 ranks India poorly in the global rankings at 168th position out of 180 countries. So in 3 ways, today, the World Environment Day 2021 with the theme ecosystem restoration is important. It is the context of the pandemic. It is the context of alarming environmental degradation happening at the global level and national level. And also it is a marking the beginning of the decade for ecosystem. So to speak on these aspects, as I mentioned, we have 5 prominent speakers. CUT's Secretary General, Mr. Pradeep S. Mehta, will be delivering the opening address. He is also the chairman of the CUT's Institute for Regulation and Competition. He is a member of the several policy-making bodies of Government of India and state governments and intergovernmental organizations. Right to healthy environment being one of the fundamental consumer rights. More than 3 decades, he is involved in various activities to protect the environment. He was also twice a member of the World Trade Organization Director General's high-level panel on defining future of trade. In India, from 2017 onwards, he is a member of the Technical and Steering Committee for the scheme on eco-labeling under the Ministry of Environment, Government of India. In Rajasthan, he is also a member of the Chief Minister's Rajasthan Economic and Transformation Advisory Council. He is a recipient of several awards and honors. In 2021, he was conferred the Scotch Challenge Award for his contributions on public policy, on competition policy. He is a prolific writer, gifted speaker, skilled trainer, and organizer. So I invite Mr. Pradeep S. Mehta to deliver the opening address. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, George, for this introductory remarks that you made in terms of the issues involved, as well as the seriousness of the problem that we are now currently facing. I mean, ecosystems, as we know, are vital for the well-being of all living things on Earth. All living things, not just human beings. The healthier our ecosystems are, the healthier the planet and its people. But recent studies show that only 3% of the land on the Earth is still ecologically intact, and there is an immense growing pressure on our forests, rivers, oceans, etc., to meet the developmental needs and personal greed. This calls for an urgent need to prevent, halt, and reverse the degradation of ecosystems on every continent and in every scheme. As I'll say later, this is something which we've been saying for several years. And unfortunately, the impact has been very little. But the fact is that this narrative has to continue, and hopefully that things will change. I mean, these significant moves should also help address global poverty, combat climate change, at least there is a better understanding on that now, and prevent mass extinction. Nevertheless, this will only succeed if everyone plays a part. This reminds me of the Earth Summit's declaration of Agenda Ya Vanananchi, which means of all citizens in Swahili, adopted as part of the Earth Charter on 15th July 1992, a good 30 years ago. And this is what I was trying to say earlier, that we've been saying this for many, many years, but the impact has been slow or very gradual. The Earth Charter becomes more relevant on this World Environment Day, when the world is grappling under the impact of COVID. It shows how disastrous, just how disastrous the consequences of ecosystem loss can be. By shrinking the area of natural habitat for animals, we have created ideal conditions for pathogens like coronaviruses to spread. It is therefore in our interest that protecting ecosystems is vital to avoid the next pandemic. Close to 3/4 of emerging infectious diseases in humans come from other animals. Land use change and wildlife exploitation increase infectious disease risk by bringing people and domestic animals in close proximity to pathogen-carrying wildlife, and by disrupting the ecological processes that keep these diseases in check. As I say this, the kind of news which are emerging on the Wuhan virus are really troublesome. And there is no definitive situation, but the fact is that even the speculation which is going on points out to the dangers of how people and are getting involved with this kind of disease risk by mixing science with our with our food habits. The economy and human well-being also depend on ecosystems for food, clean water, flood protection, erosion control, inspiration for innovation, and much more. Over half the world's global domestic product is moderately or highly dependent on biodiversity. The ongoing decline of biodiversity therefore poses important risks to society. Investing in biodiversity as part of the COVID-19 policy response can help to minimize these risks while providing immediate jobs and economic stimulus. The COVID-19 crisis has had a devastating impact on poverty levels and inequality. The January 2021 forecast from the Global Economic Prospects expect the COVID-19 induced new poor in 2020 to rise to between 119 and 124 million, with 60% living in South Asia, of which India is a major part. Ecosystem restoration can take many forms, including growing trees, greening cities, rewilding gardens, changing diets, or cleaning up rivers and coasts. It focuses on resettling our relation with nature and reflects the importance of protecting and restoring the planet's ecosystems and the species that inhabit them. If some of you have been watching the television lately, the chemical-bearing ship which left Hazira for Singapore has crashed off Sri Lanka. In the last 40 hours. It has been spewing venom into the ocean floor, including in the beaches of Sri Lanka. And just to give you an example of what is happening very recently, not that it is something which has happened for the first time, but it's just a reminder of how do we deal with the kind of sensitive ecosystems that we have with us. Policymakers across the globe are rightly focused on protecting public health, stabilizing economies, and helping those whose livelihoods are at stake. But if recovery from the crisis is to be sustainable, if our world is to become more resilient, we have to do everything we can to ensure a green recovery. Measures to protect or restore ecosystems means investing in essential ecological functions and services, enhancing their capacities to provide greater human security and developmental opportunities. OECD countries and key partner economies have so far allocated US $336 billion to environmentally positive measures within their COVID-19 recovery packages. This amounts to only 17% of the total sum so far allocated to COVID-19 economic recovery. More could have been done. Ecosystem restoration contributes to the achievement of all these. Now, this is an important point that we must look at the kind of international agenda that we've adopted in the Sustainable Development Goals of bringing poverty to an end by the year 2030, which is, of course, gone for sake. But howsoever, the restoration of ecosystem is fundamental to achieving the SDGs, mainly those on climate change, poverty eradication, food security, water, and biodiversity conservation. Goal 15 of the 2030 agenda is devoted to protect, restore, and promote sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems, sustainably manage forests, combat desertification, and halt and reverse land degradation and halt biodiversity loss. Ecosystem is also specifically linked with SDG 1, which is to end poverty, and SDG 8, to promote sustainable economic growth and decent work for all. India has been effectively committed to achieving the SDGs even before they were fully crystallized. The third edition of the SDG India Index and Dashboard 2021 was released by Niti Aayog on this Thursday, June the 3rd. It is a data-driven initiative to rank our states and union territories by computing a composite index on the SDGs. From covering 13 goals with 62 indicators in its first edition in 2018, the third edition covers 16 goals on 115 quantitative indicators with a qualitative assessment on goal 17, thereby reflecting the country's continuous efforts towards defining this important goal. Goal 17 means developmental partnerships. Overall result, the country's overall SDG score improved by 6 points from 60 in 2019 to 66 in 2020-21. This positive stride towards achieving the targets is largely driven by exemplary countrywide performance in Goal 6, which is clean water and sanitation, and Goal 7, affordable and clean energy. While Kerala, Himachal Pradesh, Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh, Goa, Karnataka, Maharashtra, and Sikkim are in the top 5 performing states, states like Bihar, Jharkhand, Assam, Arunachal Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, and including our own Rajasthan fall behind in the bottom 5, unfortunately. investing in the health of our population requires investing in the health of our planet. If we are generally going to build back better, this is critical if we were to reduce the risk just of the next pandemic. But the looming threat of climate change and biodiversity loss. Now, whenever a crisis also offers an opportunity to revisit, rethink, and replan and redo. So this, I think, is an opportune moment, in a sense, to think about the ecological situation of the world, as well as the healthcare system, which has failed so miserably. It is critical that countries integrate biodiversity considerations into their COVID-19 response and economic recovery plans. There is a need to invest in green technologies, transition from fossil fuels to clean energy, and adjust the economic development model in order to build resilience against similar public health crises in the near future. Ecosystem restoration is not just the responsibility of the Ministry of Environment and Forests, but there has to be coordinated action of various ministries and departments, including sectors like agriculture, environment, energy, mining, industry, finance, infrastructure, tourism, etc. This needs a whole of government approach. To facilitate a paradigm shift, engagement is key, whereby informed communities actively participate in environmental decision-making and governance. What our country lacks most today is an informed citizenry prepared for participatory action. A multi-generational approach to environmental education can fill this void. Thank you very much. Thank you, George.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Mehta, for your very informative opening address. You have mainly underlined the importance of ecosystem restoration in the context of the pandemic. You also had mentioned globally only 3% of the land is ecologically intact. And also by shrinking the area of natural habitats, how we are creating ideal conditions for pathogens like COVID-19. You have touched upon, you mentioned ecosystem contribute to the achievement of all the 17 SDG goals. And you also had mentioned about the India SDG index. And you concluded by saying that the ecosystem restoration is the collective responsibility of all of us. Thank you very much for the opening remarks, which will set the direction of this webinar. Now I invite the next speaker, Sara Nilsson, who is a program manager at Sustainable Consumption at Swedish Society for Nature Conservation based in Stockholm. As many of you know, SSNC is the largest environmental organization in Sweden, established way back in 1909, which is having currently over 226,000 members. It is a membership-based organization. Sara is working with SSNC since 2006 and with the global departments since 2009. Sara has a master in development studies, but would consider herself interdisciplinary since her area of study range from chemistry to people's education to music and theater. Today, Sara will be speaking about from the global perspectives on the ecosystem restoration. Now I invite Sara. Over to you, Sara.
Thank you very much, George. And thank you, Katz, for hosting this webinar and for inviting me. It's a great honor for me to be one of the speakers at this webinar. I want to start with these words. Today, we need to look after nature. Modern man has become harsh towards nature and in a way, anti-nature. Development has become the enemy of nature. It's devastating. We are children of nature. We should be in harmony with nature, but we have become nature's butchers. Nature is destroyed and we say that that is development, but it's not. Man destroys nature and calls it development. These words are not mine. They come from Mr. Sunderlal Bahuguna and his wife, Miss Bimala Bahuguna. I had the great honor to visit Mr. and Mrs. Bahaguna in their home in Dehradun in November 2016. Mr. and Mrs. Bahaguna told me their story about their life, about the mountains, the trees, a life dedicated to the environmental movement and the fight for the justice of the people and the planet. Mrs. Sunderlal Bahaguna passed away on May 21, 15 days ago, with the age of 94. But his and the Chipko movement's message to the world must, and I'm sure will, sustain. Mr. Sunderlal Bahaguna continues to tell his story. The trees were cut down to make money. We really realized that the best way to save the trees was to hug them. You cannot kill a man hugging a tree. If you cut the forest, you are destroying the basis of life. The trees clean the water and hinders landslide. Soil and water are more important than timber. Our culture is a forest culture. Our school is a forest itself. We see the forest as our home, the home of our culture. This is the fundamental difference between materialistic civilization and a spiritual relationship with the forest. We cannot accept this, that the forest is called raw material. We stayed in the forest for 8 years. The companies came at night and cut the trees. So even at night, we stayed in the forest. For the Chipko movement, both men and women were involved, but there were mainly women. The message of the movement continued through song, folk song. So Mrs. Bahaguna begins to sing. With a fragile, soft and quiet voice, she sang, "The trees give us milk, we cannot cut them down. The trees are the source of the rivers. They give life to the animals. They are the basis of everything beautiful around us. So do not chop them down, do not chop them down. Let us all come together and fight against the destruction." And Mr. Sunderlal Bahaguna continues. Women's power must be recognized and seen in society. The most important thing I learned is that women should be at the forefront of the society because they have a kind heart. Today we decide from our mind, but we need to make decisions from mind to heart to hand. Today we decide from our mind, but we need to make decisions from mind to heart to hand. And this was what a wise man said to me, from the mind to the heart to the hand. It's only when you make your decisions to your heart that you become human. This applies to all people. To start from our heart and not our brain. The brain has no emotions, only the heart has emotions. The intellectual movement is for and against, but the movement of people appeal to the heart. From your mind to your heart to your hands. Kindness is at heart. The brain is cruel, but the heart is passionate. The important thing in the movement, which the government finally accepted, was to listen to the common man, not just the government representatives. The people should be the real decision makers. And I wanted to tell you these words from Mr. and Mrs. Bahaguna because they have been and are still very important to me, and they are important for the theme of this Environmental Day. And the theme for this Environmental Day, as you know, is Restore Our Earth. And yes, it is urgent. We have been warned before that the way we are treating our Earth will sooner or later hit back on us. Now when the whole world has and still are experiences the COVID-19 pandemic, if not now, when should it be time to act? We know that if we do not act and restore our ecosystem, we will experience not only many more pandemics, we will experience climate change, more loss of biodiversity, and the generations to come will suffer even more. So, how do we restore our ecosystems? Shall we plant billions of fast-growing trees? No, the number of the trees is not the answer. The quantity of the trees will not give us back a healthy environment. That's why too many climate adaptation programs sometimes overturns more than it helps. It's about how the restoration works together with nature. with a natural, original ecosystem that once was there. We need revitalization adapted to the traditional habitat. A big-scale project not adaptive to the nature it is in will not give valuable biological results. And how do we do? When we listen to the people that for generations live in that particular area, we have the true experts. The solutions are local, suitable for the ecosystem and the people who live there. The knowledge base must be built on inclusion and participation of the people with a local knowledge. Intergenerational learning, knowledge passed on from generations to generations and flowered with new insights during the way. In Sweden, where I come from, our indigenous people are called Sami. The Sami people have 200 to 300 different words for describing snow. Each word presents a characteristic that you need to know when you live with nature. I can tell you that I know only 3 words for snow. In traditional societies around the world, there are stories about the sacred tree. In Bishnoi community, in your beautiful country, India, they call it Keyedi. It's there in Mozambique, and it was there in the deep forest of my home county in Sweden. The sacred tree tells us that we need to protect nature if nature shall be kind to us. There is increasing evidence that indigenous people and the local communities are the best guardians of the world's last remaining forest and biodiversity. Therefore, it is critical to further strengthen the voice of the indigenous people and recognize that their knowledge as part of the solutions to fight the climate crisis, protect biodiversity, and enhance sustainable development. Both the global report of the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services and the special report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change now support this argument. We also need to work towards binding treaties for transnational corporations. We have already tried to hold companies responsible on a voluntary basis. It is now proved that this does not give us the results we need. We therefore need laws and regulation. We need binding treaties. As you can see, we are one of the organizations pushing for binding treaties within the EU, human rights due diligence, to hold the companies responsible for violations of human rights and environmental destructions. Human rights due diligence is a risk management tool. It is a process organizations and companies should carry out to identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for how they address actual and potential adverse human rights impact on their own operations, their supply chain, and other business relationships. EU is the big market. For example, related to deforestation, EU's consumption stands for 16% of the total deforestation in the world. To compare this with China, that is number 1, that stands for 24%, and India, that is number 3, that stands for 9%. If binding treaties are pushed through in the EU, it will send important signals to other countries that it is possible to regulate and claim responsibility, and to the companies that the future of doing business is the sustainable way. So, to restore our Earth, we need to listen to the voices and the stories of the people still living close to nature. We need binding treaties. It should not be profitable to destroy our Earth. We also need to work from where we are, even for us living in a city. We can start with greening and rewidening our cities and home gardens and changing our diets today. We can rethinking our consumption. All this will also have good effects on our health. And this is the beauty of all this, that the solution for the Earth is also the solution for the well-being of the humans. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sara, for the very, very informative speech. You started by quoting late Sundarlal Bahuguna in detail how he had focused on underlining the development has to be in harmony with nature. I know that, in 2016, you visited the Kejari village near Jodhpur in Rajasthan as well, where initially the Chipko movement started in 18th century. We together went and met the Vishnoi women in those villages. So it was very, very informative, and what Mr. Bahuguna had mentioned is very, very relevant in the present context. And you also had underlined the point that women has to be at the center of activities, those who are the daily managers of natural resources. And you also said people has to be involved in the real decision making, and the government is having a responsibility to listen to them. From quoting from late Sundarlal Bahuguna's life, how he fought with the government. We also take this opportunity to pay tribute to late Sundarlal Bahuguna. Then you had mentioned about the context of Sweden as well, how the indigenous people are living very close to the nature, and the number of words they are having to describe the snow. And they are the real guardians of the environment. And the linkage between the human rights and the environmental rights. Then you said the environmental well-being is a must for the human well-being. You concluded with that. So it was very, very informative. Thanks for that speech. Now I will move on to the third speaker. We have Bethan Laughlin, who is currently the Sustainable Consumption Lead at the Consumers International and working to drive sustainable consumption worldwide. As many of you know, Consumers International is the membership organization of consumer groups around the world, bringing together over 200 member organizations in more than 100 countries. CUTS is one of the founding members of Consumers International. CI is also the co-lead of United Nations Consumer Information Program for Sustainable Consumption and Production as part of SDG 12. Bethan joined CI from a background of working in the UK Parliament as a policy advisor in the House of Lords with a specific focus on environmental policy. We are very happy that Bethan is joining with us. Bethan will be speaking from a sustainable consumption perspective on the theme. Over to you, Bethan.
There we go. Thank you so much. Thank you for a lovely introduction and for inviting me to speak today. It's a real pleasure to be here and an honour, so thank you. As George has said, I've been asked to speak today about the intersection between sustainable consumption and biodiversity. But as with all things around biodiversity, it's a huge topic. So I'm going to focus in on the slightly more niche area of communication and how we communicate with consumers. So we're a global organization at CI, as George said, we're across 200 countries. So I'm also going to take as much of a global view as possible. And I think that when we're talking about sustainability and in all things, it's important, and biodiversity, it's important that we set the scene a little bit. In understanding the scale of what we're up against. And I'm going to echo a tiny bit of what Pradeep said in his introductory words, so thank you for introducing that. But there's as Pradeep said, in the World Economic Forum recently announced and their study of the fact that biodiversity is worth about half of the world's global economy. So that's $44 trillion US, which is utterly reliant on biodiversity to create that revenue. But that also means that's 44 trillion that's threatened by biodiversity loss. And the irony remains that the tree doesn't have a value until it's cut down in our current economic model. However, it's also not right to just think about biodiversity in the context of money. We all know that this has huge impacts on people and planet. And just yesterday, the UN announced a report that said that we're now using 1.6 times the amount of natural resources that the Earth can sustain. So this means that we're already seeing over 40% of the world's population being adversely affected by ecosystem degradation, all of which is affecting human health, nutrition, livelihoods, soil health, pollution, food security, water. The list goes on. We are so interconnected with our natural world. And biodiversity protection and restoration is, like so many 21st century issues, important for a multitude of reasons. It is intrinsically linked to climate change solutions, to pollution and the water crisis, along with the impact on human health and the increased existence of zoonotic diseases, again, as Pradeep mentioned in his opening statement. It's been mentioned by previous speakers that the UN in 2016 announced that 75% of emerging infectious diseases were traced from animals, meaning that they're zoonotic. The decline of biodiversity as a result of human behavior, including the destruction of habitats, urbanization, intensive farming, human-induced climate change, is causing a closer interaction between animals, plants, and humans, and this is driving disease. The rise of these diseases is making it crystal clear that human health and the health of our ecosystems are far more interconnected than we ever gave credit for. And all of what I've just said makes clear that it's in everybody's interests, our health, the economy, human happiness, climate change, to scale up biodiversity protection and restoration. The question remains, how? Now, I work in sustainable consumption and production, so that's what we're going to talk about. And it's really important, I think, that we view sustainable consumption and production as not only some of the root causes of the issues I've just laid out, but also as a lens for identifying solutions to those problems. The scale of biodiversity restoration that's needed is absolutely staggering. The UN report I mentioned that came out yesterday, they said that we're going to need to see 1 billion hectares of land restored by 2030 in order to keep our biodiversity at a safe level. That 1 billion hectares is equivalent to a landmass the size of China. And although restoration is vital, it is absolutely fundamental, protection and restoration, it can't happen in isolation. It needs to happen in concurrence with innovation in the way that we produce and consume goods and services as a global society, but also on a regional, local and national level. So that brings us to consumers. Now, I know there's a lot of consumer advocates on this call, and we're all aware that consumers have a huge amount of power in the marketplace. We can put pressure on companies to change. We can try to put pressure on our governments to implement legislation. And vitally, we can vote with our money and use that as a statement for what we're willing to endorse when it comes to sustainability. The power of consumers should not be underestimated. However, and this is a big however, it's vital that we don't put the burden of responsibility for sustainability solely on the shoulders of consumers. Consumers need to have access to transparent, clear and comparable information about the biodiversity and climate impact of their purchases. And without work with business and policy and civic society, that will not be possible. And at the heart of all of this, a big part of this is how we communicate to consumers and with consumers about sustainability. And also how we understand the barriers that consumers face in making sustainable choices. So at the heart of this is a word called greenwashing, which many of you will be aware of, which is where consumers are misled into thinking that a purchase is green when in fact it isn't. Businesses have a responsibility not to greenwash, but the problem is it's not illegal. In almost all jurisdictions, it's a marketing tool, and there are very few regulations on that. So consumers are often misled into thinking that their purchase is leading to a change in the supply chain towards sustainability, when in fact the opposite is often true. And greenwashing is rife, it's everywhere. In 2020, IcePen analysed 500 consumer goods websites and found that 40% were using misleading green claims on how they market towards consumers. And to make this a little bit more real, I'm going to give an example of some work that we've recently done at Consumers International. So last year, we did a coordinated action with a number of our members looking at recyclability and packaging. So we conducted a study on packaging of 11 internationally branded products. So these are sort of normal everyday products that people purchase across 9 countries. So this covered over 1 million consumers. And we did a piece of work into looking at how easy those materials were to recycle. Now, we found that across all of the 9 participating countries, all consumers faced packaging that was misleading, unclear, or not recyclable in practice. So we took an average of those 11 products, we did an aggregate, and we found that 35% of the materials used, although recyclable in principle, although they said they were recyclable on the label, in practice, it was impossible for consumers to recycle them. So, and this becomes all the more of an issue when you realize that internationally, across the whole of use of plastic in our world, only 9% of plastic has ever been recycled. Now, what this means, this is quite staggering and quite unpleasant, but I think it's really an important thing to make clear when we're thinking about biodiversity, when we're thinking about the way we look about sustainable consumption and production, is that we really need to zoom in on making sustainable options as easy as possible, as accessible as possible. And also that if something is recyclable in principle, but not in practice, the consumer cannot be expected to know that. There is a responsibility of legislators and of businesses to make important steps forward. Now, this isn't to say there isn't hope. There's a huge amount of hope and huge amounts of opportunity for action, which I hope many people on this call can get involved in. The COP26 negotiations are happening this November after being delayed from COVID. And as is the Biodiversity COP, or COP15, which is also due to take place this year. These will be international moments for negotiation and consideration from national governments about how we move forward with climate pledges and with biodiversity. And on a local level, there's incredible work taking place. I'm going to echo what Sara said, in that we need to be listening to Indigenous and local people and women about how to learn from them and how we restore. A couple of examples from our work in Green Action Week, which we do alongside SSNC. In Malaysia, our Malaysian member worked for their Green Action Week campaign on tackling decreasing levels of biodiversity by promoting seed saving in their community between farmers and gardeners and the public. In Tonga in 2019, there was an amazing campaign by the local organisation to fight against the disappearance of medicinal plants in Tonga. And this was done through a campaign that embedded rural and urban worked with rural and urban communities to communicate, exchange knowledge, and share the plants among the communities. There's amazing things to be learned on the local level, and there's huge opportunities for international action. It's about bridging that gap. There are opportunities for global collective action, but a shift needs to happen to ensure that consumers and the way we consume and produce on a daily level is understood as a powerful tool, and that consumers are supported in the marketplace. Fundamentally, and this is really important, there is a need for a default shift. We need sustainable goods to move from being an active choice, something that people have to put time and money and energy into something that's a default standard for everyone. And also, vitally, it needs to be affordable and accessible for people across the world. Sustainability can't be something for rich countries alone. My final words on this: the events of the last year have made clear that in our globalized world, acting together, supporting the vulnerable, and thinking holistically is the only way we can emerge properly from crisis. In looking at biodiversity, it's essential that consumers are given agency and education in how they consume, but it's also vital that they are not given the burden of responsibility, and that they are supported by businesses, policy, and civic society in scaling up change. The scale of the issue that I laid out at the beginning, that $44 trillion, means that it's in the world's best interests to ensure sustainable consumption is accessible, affordable, and practical for all consumers, regardless of where they live, in order to benefit our economy, our health, our happiness, and the future generations to follow us. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm really looking forward to hearing from the other speakers. Back to you, George.
Thanks, Bethan, for sharing your thoughts on the theme from a sustainable consumption perspective. You started by mentioning about the World Economic Forum, how countries are pledging trillions of dollars for the restoration. And also you have flashed some of the global, ecosystem degradation issues and the effort for the restoration of 1 million hectares, equivalent to China, but such things are not easy. And also you have focused on the consumer power. Consumers can change the companies, but at the same time, you have mentioned the ounce of this sustainable consumption cannot be only upon on the consumers. And you also have touched upon some of the work done by the membership at the grassroots level, referring to about the work in Malaysia, including the Green Action Week campaign that CI is coordinating. And also you have mentioned, the consumers, the way they are consuming and producing, there has to be a change for bringing in the bigger change at the global level. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. We will come back later if the time permit with the questions. Now I invite Dr. K. Anand, who is the co-founder of Junglescapes, which is located in Bengaluru, which is a grassroots non-profit working on initiatives for ecological restoration of degraded forest ecosystem. Junglescape have restored over 2,000 acres of degraded forest near Bandipur Tiger Reserve in Karnataka. Dr. Anand is a materials scientist by education. He is an alumnus of the Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore, and has doctorate from North Carolina University, USA, and has over 40 US patents in his technical field. Dr. Anand will be talking about the national perspective on the efforts for ecological restoration. Now I invite Dr. Anand. Over to you, Dr. Anand.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Cheriyan, and thank you, Mr. Pradeep, for having invited me. And thank you, fellow speakers, for such a stimulating start to this session. Yeah, it comes back to COVID. And where we are right now is that every activity that seems to generate economic worth is fraught with risks. Whether you work for an IT company, whether you're in a manufacturing shop floor, whether you commute in a bus, whether you go in a train, you are essentially risking yourself and fellow human beings in transmitting COVID all around. But the national imperative today continues to be to deal with COVID, but also push for economic growth. Because you take a look at a country like India, where more than 30% of the population is in poverty, and millions more have been pushed into poverty because of COVID. What do? We have to continue with economic growth. And if nature capital is slaughtered, so be it. But is that fair? Is that correct? Don't we have a way out? So what I really want to argue, based on what we know, is that there is a way out. And that way out is ecological restoration. You take a look at India. When you start talking about ecological restoration, the forests are the topmost thing that come to our mind. So we're talking about forests. We have about 650,000 square kilometers earmarked as forests, out of which barely 40 to 50% are in good shape. The remaining 50% are either grasslands or degraded forests all across the country. And you take a look at India's water bodies near urban areas. Most of them are very heavily polluted. The rivers are polluted. The coastlines are polluted. You take a look at Even things like quarrying close by in urban areas to facilitate construction. That represents essentially a desert, very, very heavily degraded landscapes. All of these need to be restored for various reasons. I'll start talking about the forest first, because that's really where I've spent 13, 14 years. And that's really where I see huge opportunities for the country. So what does restoration actually entail, and what opportunities does it actually bring to the table? What does it cost for the system? Is it doable? So that's the first question I want to answer. The second question is, where do we do this restoration? Are there locations which are essentially opportune, which are going to give us the maximum returns for nature and for the society? And number three, if you were to kind of take this model and build it up and scale it up, what does it actually mean for the country? So the first question, what does this restoration actually mean? One of the speakers actually talked about restoration is not exactly planting a billion trees, and I completely agree. It's monoculture. It's not a forest. It doesn't really sequester carbon. It doesn't really provide for wildlife. Restoration actually means working with nature and essentially augmenting its capability to repair itself, helping it become more resilient. So the context is in a landscape where human presence is such that the rate at which we destroy nature is greater than the rate at which the nature can repair itself, you're going to set a cycle of restoration, of degradation. It consists of barren pieces of land, compacted soil, hardly any topsoil left, rapid river water or rainwater runoffs. And the cycles that promote vegetation are essentially broken. There is no nutrient cycle in the soil. There's hardly any moisture retention in the soil, and we need to fix that first. And we do that through essentially local know-how and people's efforts. It consists of measures like contour trenches, short trenches to help existing saplings grow, check dams at the right location, ponds at the right location, gully plugs to prevent gully erosion. You do all these measures at scale, and you'll find that an acre of land would take only about 10,000 rupees, 150 US dollars, to actually fix over a period of time. A 2,000 acre landscape which gets restored provides for about 100 families for 7 to 8 years. They make livelihoods which is twice as much as casual labor in the farms. And when you start doing that in locations where wildlife frequent, what happens is that the natural landscape begins to revive, partly because the herbivores distribute seeds. The carnivores essentially find prey base right around, and they don't attack cattle. Elephants and gaur and boar and wild boar do not invade fields for food because the food is available in the forest. And over an 8 to 10 year period, we've actually restored a very vital corridor that essentially caters for wildlife and spillover population from existing tiger reserves. It's a very small concrete example that I would give with facts and figures, but what does it translate to as far as the country is concerned? We have 50 tiger reserves across the country. They occupy about 65,000 square kilometers. Each tiger reserve essentially has reserve forests abutting it. These reserve forests are essentially multi-use landscapes. Many of them are actually degraded for various reasons. There are local communities that are dependent on the forest for livelihood. Now, can we make the local communities the restorers of these forests and reproduce this model? Then you're talking about 30,000 square kilometers getting restored next to tiger reserves, which translates into around 160, close to 10, multiply with 200, you have millions of acres getting involved. That kind of a landscape is really opportune for restoration Because if you do that, you essentially take care of wildlife corridors, you take care of human-animal conflicts, you take care of wildlife protection, you take care of watersheds for the rivers which are originating from these forests, and it's carbon sequestered, the country greatly benefits. Then what are the other opportunity areas which are what I would call as low-hanging fruits as far as the country is concerned? We really have two classes of rivers in the country. Rivers that are essentially dependent on snow melt from the Himalayas, and rivers which are dependent on forests in the central portions of India, like Narmada and Tapti, and the peninsular rivers like Kaveri, Godavari, and Krishna. Now, the health of these rivers depends on the health of the forests in the landscapes that they originate from. Unfortunately, human greed essentially has intervened, and many of the upper reaches of Western Ghats, regions that get anywhere from 2,000 to 8,000 millimeters of rain, have actually become plantations. Exotic plantations consisting of eucalyptus, pine, acacia, blue gum, occupying in Nilgiris alone 2,000 square kilometers, in Palni Hills around 2,000 square kilometers, and the rest of Western Ghats in Karnataka and Kerala and the 2,000 square kilometers. When you take these 6,000 to 8,000 square kilometers of land and convert them back to rainforests, you can improve water runoffs by about 25 to 30%. It could be rainforests, it could be sholas, it could be grasslands, but you would essentially improve water runoffs by at least 20 to 30% and make many of the rivers that are originating from there close to perennial, ensuring that agriculture is sustainable, ensuring the cities like Bangalore, Hyderabad, Chennai have adequate water supply. The impact is huge. So what are we talking about? Just out of forests which are feeding the rivers, and just out of forests which are connecting tiger reserves, you're looking at areas which are in the range of 50,000 square kilometers. Hundreds of millions of acres of land that needs to be reconverted. When you start putting the math of around 20,000 rupees per acre, which is a very realistic figure, you can find out that this constitutes maybe a 60 to 80,000 crore rupee economy. And we've not talked about the rest of the degraded forests. We've not talked about the water bodies. We've not talked about the rivers. So when you consider all of this, restoration can essentially become the fourth pillar in the country after agriculture, after manufacturing, after services. Restoration can be something which is as big as the software industry in the country. This is the opportunity we have in the country to make a difference, to essentially provide for livelihood for the poorest of the poor, to create human capital in new forms, academics, students, PhDs, NGOs, expanded forest department, which would make it all possible, to essentially create what I would call as the fourth pillar. It's no wonder that UN essentially said we need to restore 1 billion acres every year, which is what Bethany said. And it's no wonder that UN has actually called this as a decade of restoration. If you subscribe to this message and act on it, I think India will be different. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Anand, for sharing your wonderful thought from your practical experience. You started by referring to the pandemic and said that, the economic activities we need to restart, but that is a big opportunity for restoration. And also you have mentioned about the condition of the forest, the water bodies in the country. And you defined the restoration and spoke very much from your hands-on experience, what are the efforts made for the restoration and how, the forest can be rejuvenated for the rainforest, and how it can feed the rivers and, address the water conditions, water availability in many of the cities. And you concluded with the hope that, this decade can really contribute towards a restoration. And let us hope that and together work for the restoration of the ecosystem. Once again, thanks for sharing your thoughts. Now let us move on to Mr. Aman Singh. Aman Singh is the founder of Krishi, Avam, Paristhitiki Sansthan, that is Organization for the Development of Ecology and Agriculture, and chairman of the membership committee in the Global Council of ICCA Consortium. ICCA stands for Indigenous and Community Conserved Areas. He has overseen the regeneration of over 140 orams, that is community conserved areas in Rajasthan. Working on restoring orams and documentation, he has written on community conserved areas, ecology, and more recently launched Oram Atlas. He has received numerous awards and much recognition in India and abroad. And very recently, in the month of May, on the World Biodiversity Day, he won the prestigious India Biodiversity Awards 2021. He will be speaking from the grassroots perspective and also will be briefly sharing some of his efforts in Rajasthan for the restoration of the ecosystem. Over to you, Mr. Aman Singh.
Thank you, Cheriyan sir. First of all, I would like to thank to the CUTS team for inviting me to this very important webinar. As earlier as speakers have also mentioned that the UN General Assembly declared 2021 to 2030 to be the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration. And as quoted in the UN Decade statement that ecosystem supports all life on Earth, the healthier our ecosystem are, the healthier the planet and its people. It will succeed if everyone play a part. The resolution of UN stress on the importance of full involvement of relevant stakeholders, including the local communities. But unfortunately, the beginning of the decade and humanity has faced and still continues to face particular risk and vulnerability from the COVID-19 pandemic as the ripple effect of the pandemic through all aspects of society. The rural communities actually are the most suffered as they do not have enough financial backup to start an enterprise and earn a better livelihood. And therefore, the demand for natural resources is increasing as the local community groups in varying degree are directly depend on local ecosystem for grazing, fuel wood, leaves, honey, wild grains, berries, and other NTFPs. On other hand, if we look at the last 50 years, seen an extensive desiccation of water sources, rampant spread of invasive species, and all-round encroachment. These have in turn led to undermining of indigenous irrigation system as well as decline in the rain-fed cropping, which bodes ill for the capabilities of the rural population to cope with the anticipated stresses of environmental volatility and climate change. Thus, it is necessary to strategize and intervene at the ecosystem level to improve further environmental losses and increase vulnerability to local livelihoods. Actually, in this regard, we have to have a long vision where we need to involve strengthening of local communities particularly. And through them, the local property resources, CPRs, along with synergizing with the state intervention activities in a way which benefit marginal, landless, agro-pastoralist community, keeping in mind that the rural areas of the potentially high return migration post-COVID. I just saw in the chat box, there was a question that how how we'll deal this problem. And this is going in rural area, this is going to be a high return migration because of the COVID. In this case, it is very imperative that we strengthen every possible means of which livelihood may be secured in absence of wage earning opportunity. When I say wage earning opportunity means we have to find the solution within the community, common resources available in the villages. Based on my experiences working with the grassroots-based organization on KRAPAVIS, we have restored 140 degraded organs, and thousands of them we have documented in form of district level directories. And you know what are organs actually? Some of the participants may not be aware with these terms. Organs basically in Rajasthan are the community managed ecosystem. It's a common land that act as a store of biodiversity, enable effective water management, and serves as a community-based livelihood system. The livelihood aspect is also very much associated with these organs. If we go by figure, there are estimated 25,000 organs, and which cover about 2% of total geographical area. If we add the Goche land into this, it makes 5% of the total geographical area, which is a very big land mass, which is a very, very big area within the Rajasthan. And this serves as a reserve of a variety of NTFPs, non-timber forest producers, yielding species. Therefore, we have to look solutions such as traditions of conservation like orans. Those contains unique and fragile terrestrial and freshwater ecosystems that comprises rare, threatened, and endangered species and habitats, keystone species of evolutionary significance, and wildlife, cultivars, plants, etc. The site would also be culturally, aesthetically, and ethically important in the context of conservation and management. Sometimes there are some taboos associated with the orans, but they play a decisive role in shaping the ecosystem services rendered by these community conserved areas. Like livestock grazing, NTFPs collected from orans provide a major source of livelihood for the local communities, particularly the pastoralist communities. Thus, the primary objective of ecosystem restoration should focus on to regeneration biodiversity and enhance the range of benefits of the rural communities for building a system which characterized by high biodiversity, sustainable use of resources, and conscious stakeholder community. In brief, the restoration activities could focus on a trinity of forest, livestock, and agriculture. I would like to share following aspect which used to promote ecosystem restoration in my work. When we're talking about the common lands, so we have to look how we can regenerate biodiversity. Biodiversity can be regenerated in number of measures through propagating trees, grass species, particularly the indigenous grass species, traditional grasslands, and there are other CPRs as well. Orans are also part of the rangeland ecosystem and to be protected from further deterioration. Restore these systems by seeding with indigenous flora, including trees, useful for domesticated and wild animals, in addition to soil and water conservation programs, and remove the most important thing. Actually, most of these common lands, most of the orans are invaded by this invasive species. And particularly, you know that this Bilaiti babool, Juliflora. The second component which we have been utilizing in our work, the rehabilitation of water storage structures or building new water structures like construction, renovation of water harvesting by utilizing the traditional water techniques. In Rajasthan, there are a number of wonderful sustainable technologies available. There maybe need some sort of modification. They need some modern addition to that. But there are good technologies. So we applied in our work while we were doing the renovation work. Another important aspect, because when we talk about Oran, it's not just a piece of land. This is whole ecosystem. It's basically a landscape where agriculture in the downstream is also part of that landscape. So what we have been doing, we're doing reviving and promoting sustainable agriculture using diversity, using like compost. We have traditional seed banks, agroforestry, livestock products like manure, herbal plants, number of herbal plants we have been raising in the nursery, in our own nursery, number of water conservation. Also, we tried drip irrigation in some area, solar panel system, also we adopted in some of the villages, and tried to promote the natural farming by reducing application of chemical inputs like nitrogen fertilizer and pesticides. Another important part, because Rajasthan is a livestock dependent economy. So we cannot see in isolation orans or even other type of common land. So we have to look at that how the livestock can thrive, can be better managed. So what we have been doing, that we have been adopting number of customary practices such as rotational grazing, the animals in the agriculture land, also after harvesting of crops, panning systems, migration to forest, to the mountain zones during monsoon and cropping seasons, according to the season, and coexistence of another important aspect we have to find, because like earlier speaker have talked about much about the national park, tiger reserve. Within the tiger reserve, within these protected areas, we have to find out the coexistence possibilities, how we can have association with wild flora and fauna consideration and balance. For socio-economic and ecological development, we also done number of the interventions, taking the ethno-veterinary practices, which has been happened around orans and grazing lands. So we're just trying to revise those traditions for animal health. So also the breed, within the Rajasthan, there were fantastic animal breeds, which even look at the Murra in Alwar area, which basically from the adjoining area, native Haryana, which is one of the best breed in the world. We have similarly cow breeds, Nagori Gai, we have Tharpar cow. So we need to basically work on these breeds, and we have been doing this. We've been doing this in our work. It's a part of, in a holistic way, which is part also revival of whole Oran system. In addition to above all, the most important part, truly involvement of the local community. We need to document their knowledge. There is wonderful knowledge with them. There is innovations, customary governance and law systems, which can be considered to bring them back. Planning for restoring ecosystem, common lands, including ponds, tanks, mountains, and grasslands and farmlands. So these were some of the points which I wanted to raise in brief here, that how we can restore the local system. And now this is the high time when we need to focus at the ground. We have to look solution within the villages, within the community. And particularly when we're going to have a very high level of post-COVID return migration, this is a challenge, how the community can be accommodated within these lands, on these common lands. There may not be wages, but still there are possibilities to sustain that population which is coming back to the villages. So thank you very much. Thank you to everyone, to Mr. Mehta, to George Cheriyan, to Amardeep ji, and Dharam Dharmen Chaturvedi, for giving me this opportunity to come and talk a little bit about the orans and my work doing directly with the community. Thank you very much, Cheriyan.
Thank you, Mr. Aman Singh, for sharing your vast knowledge on working at the grassroots with us. You started by saying that the local community is very much dependent upon the local natural resources, and you have shared your experience of developing 140 orams in Rajasthan, which the community depend for the non-forest products. And also you have shared, the vital role that the orams are playing in the ecosystem restoration. Other than that, you also had mentioned about the soil and water conservation efforts in common land and various other things you have touched upon, making use of the traditional water conservation systems by updating that, about the herbal plants, about the solar panels, about the natural farming, about the animal breeds and all. And especially you have underlined, about the involvement of the local community and making use of their traditional knowledge. And you concluded by saying that the post-COVID return migration, how we can find solutions within the villages itself. We will continue to be in touch with you and see that, how we can replicate some of these efforts. Actually, our time is almost coming to an end. A few minutes we will spend on responding to some of the questions which was raised in the inbox. I request my colleague, Mr. Amardeep Singh, to raise a couple of questions which the speakers can address. Over to you, Amar.
Yeah, thank you. So there are actually a few questions, but I will take a relevant couple of questions. So one is from Himanshu, Jagannath University. He's asking, what can we do about the pandemic waste created so that it does not harm the environment? Or how can we reuse the waste so that amount of waste on ground and ocean decreases? So the speaker, he has not mentioned whom he want to ask. Any speaker, one of the speaker can address this question.
Bethan, you want to respond to that about the waste emerging out? Very briefly.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a really important question, and the answer is not an easy one, because what we've seen with COVID, sorry, the lighting is terrible. What we've seen with before COVID is there were lots of steps towards moving away from, in some ways, away from single-use items. And then with COVID, because of the health impact, obviously people have moved back to single-use. Now that's not unsurprising, and for health reasons, it's probably a good thing, but it does raise enormous questions about waste management. Now, the thing about waste management is it's not a very attractive thing for policymakers to think about much. They don't really like talking about how we deal with our rubbish, about recycling, but it's an absolutely imperative move that we need to move towards circularity, which is this idea of the materials we have in the system being put back into the system for reuse. A term I like to use is that with our natural world, if you can't grow it, you have to mine it. So that means that every single material in the system has to be either mined, grown, or we can mine from what we've got on the surface. And mining doesn't just have to be cobalt or lithium or rubber. It can be cotton. It can be a myriad of other materials. So I don't have an answer for you because we don't have an answer. But the two big things we need is infrastructure that moves towards circularity and embeds circularity in everyday life, and a really large discussion on the international scale about how we move collectively towards not just recycling, but waste management in general, that isn't so regional. Like, for example, in the UK, where I am, my local authority, which is a few miles wide, has a completely different set of recycling rules to if I went 20 miles down the road. That's ridiculous. We should have a UK-wide recycling system, and there are similar things all across the world. So there's a need for standardization, simplification, and investment. Yeah.
Thank you, Bethan. Dr. Anand, you also want to add anything?
I want to point out some research being done in IIT Madras in the area of plastic waste management, where plastic, cotton, many of these things essentially are converted into energy in some form at temperatures which are well away from the regime where you have dioxins getting generated, so that this reconversion is actually safe. But I do agree that not all the technologies are readily available and completely mature. They're still at about a TRL 6-7 as far as safe recycling of bio-waste are concerned, in a manner which is truly a circular economy. So that piece has to really be worked out. But I think there are some reasonable answers from IIT Madras. If people want more information, I'll try and do the connection.
Thank you for that response, and we will get in touch with you to get more information on that so that we can share. Yeah. Amar, I think due to the time constraint, any more question you have, or?
We have a few more questions.
Yeah.
So one maybe our Indian speaker can address, because it was related to government efforts. The John Pakiraj, he's asking how the government can integrate biodiversity into recovery from COVID-19. So this is the question.
Maybe I would like to respond on this.
Yep. Please go ahead.
Yeah. As this is very interesting question, I would say. Actually, as I also mentioned, that this is going to be a very high return migration back into the rural areas, and it's already happening, and happening in a very large way. The which possibility I say that we have a lot of common lands, which is actually, it's in the form of degraded. We are not getting any production from this. So our efforts, our government efforts should be to restore that land. And restoring that land, people will benefit in a number of ways. They will get direct benefit, direct employment when restoration program will take place. Also, restoring that land in long run, we have enough resources, natural resources, to feed our animals, because as I said, that one of the component of our livelihood in Rajasthan is the livestock. So we need grasses, we need good grasslands, we need good common lands where our animals can sustain, and ultimately our livelihood sustain, our population sustain. So I think where we need to focus is to restore these CPRs, common lands, and we have plenty of common lands. I gave an example that 5% only open or grazing category. It's a very large chunk of land in this state. We need to focus on these lands. This is my own perspective working with communities for the last 30 years. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Aman Singh. I think we will not take more questions, but one question I want to just respond, because it is directly addressed to Kurtz. The question is what Kurtz is doing or planning for the betterment of the ecosystem. It is asked by Selvi C. Mary Dixon from Jaipur itself. I would like to respond to that. As I mentioned, from its inception, for the last more than 3 decades, Kurtz was involved in the environmental protection as well, being right to healthy environment, one of the fundamental consumer rights, and sustainable consumption was included part of this right in 1999. So we have done a lot of things. The Eco Fridge campaign in the 1990s. Recently, to mention a few, CUTS was the regional resource agency for the National Environment Awareness Campaign of the Ministry of Environment and Forests, which is unfortunately now discontinued. So we were the nodal agency for Rajasthan and providing funding support for about 250 to 300 organizations in a year to have a campaign on a specific theme related to environment. And we have presently a large area of work on sustainable consumption. We also are working, promoting the organic consumption and farming in 10 districts of Rajasthan. So you might be knowing that organic agriculture contribute to mitigating the greenhouse effect and global warming through its ability to sequester carbon in the soil. And also organic farming on small farms leads to greater benefits for the ecosystem by improving soil organic matter, reducing erosion and increasing the biodiversity. So organic farming is having a direct linkage with the ecosystem restoration. And we are working for the last 7 years in 10 districts of Rajasthan among the consumers and among the farmers, and also advocacy with the government. And also we have the, coordinating the Green Action Week campaign, which is the global campaign for sustainable consumption in partnership with SSNC for the non-CI members in India for the last 5 years. These are some of the efforts in the brief timing. There are a lot of the things. But before I hand over to Amardeep, I would like to request Mr. Mehta whether he want to add anything, what CUTS is doing in the area of ecosystem restoration. Now I invite my colleague Amardeep Singh, who is the Senior Program Officer at CUTS, for summing up the discussions in the webinar and also to propose the vote of thanks. Over to you, Amar.
Great. So thank you, sir. So our most valued guest speakers and all the participants, and let me call it here environmental fraternity all together. So it's my privilege to have been asked to propose vote of thanks on this occasion. On behalf of CUTS International, extend very hearty vote of thanks to all of the speakers for gracing your important work and sharing your thoughts and experience with us today. A big thank you to Mr. Pradeep Mehta, Secretary General CUTS International, for his opening remarks on importance of restoring the ecosystem in the context of pandemic. He talked very well about the importance of ecosystem for the well-being of all living things on Earth. He calls for urgent need to prevent and reverse the degradation of ecosystem on every continent and every ocean. He very well again talk about the whole of government approach to better coordination by government agencies, and because ecosystem restoration is not only a responsibility of only one environment department, so the better coordination is required from the government agencies and departments. He also talked about informed community model for active participation from the community. He said this is important to understand and need to follow to achieve the targets for restoration of our environment. So thank you, Mr. Mehta. And we must also mention our deep sense of appreciation to Ms. Sara Nilsson, Program Manager, Sustainable Consumption, SSNC from Sweden, for her remarks on ecosystem restoration from a global perspective. In her talk, she talked about her global work as well as her experience from different parts of the world. She talked about the Sundarlal Bahugunaji's the Chipko movement and the Khejrli village of Jodhpur Chipko movement, which was started from Rajasthan, and also talk about the experience from Sweden, where she mentioned about the local community which knows the more than 200 names of snow, and how their knowledge is important for the restoration of our environment. So and it is also duty for all of us, all of the community, to change the pattern of the lifestyle and also the pattern of the food. And also thank you very much, Sara, for talking all those aspects in this webinar today. We also like to express our sincere thanks to Ms. Bethan, Laughlin Sustainable Consumption Lead from Consumer International, for giving an excellent coverage to sustainable consumption perspective for ecosystem restoration. She discussed global issues of destruction in ecosystem and human intervention, which is destructing our ecosystem. You also talk about how the 75% disease now coming from the animals. We are talking from the pandemic point of view. So, and also you talk about the growing urbanization is one of the reason for all those issues. So, and also the consumers can create pressure on government and market, and we all should not, nobody should underestimate the power of consumers. So thank you for talking about from the consumer perspective and sharing your consumer aspect. Further, we are also grateful to Dr. K. Anand, who is the co-founder of Junglescapes Charitable Trust, Bengaluru, to deliver your talk on national perspective of ecosystem restoration. You shared ecosystem in India, and you talk about the forest, river, and urban areas, the various aspects you discussed today, for which are important to restoration of our the environment. So, and also experience from the Junglescape, how the restoration was done by the organization. And you also talk about the health of rivers and forests, and all depends on the ecosystem, on each other. So thank you, Dr. Anand, for your remarks. We also wish to express our gratitude to Mr. Aman Singh, founder of KRAPAVIS from Rajasthan, for providing encouragement by sharing your grassroots perspective and practical efforts for restoration of ecosystem. He talked about the efforts of restoration, mainly the experience from the Rajasthan grassroots level, and talking about the ORANs, which are community preserved forest. And you also talk about the role of the different stakeholders are important, especially the community which has the wonderful knowledge about their ecosystem. They should be involved in the planning and the management of our ecosystem. So thank you, Mr. Aman Singh, for your remarks. We also thank Mr. George Cheriyan, Director, CUTS International here, for moderating today's discussion, this important discussion very well, and setting the agenda for this discussion. It helped to bring different aspect of environment, and to bring all together the aspect, and to reach at the conclusion. So thank you, Mr. Cheriyan, for your moderation today. We also convey our sincere thanks to all the participants for their active participation today from different parts of the world, and it is quite encouraging to see the participation from, I think, more than 9 countries. There are participants, and more than 23 states we have participants. So thank you all. We appreciate your involvement, and thank you for sparing your valuable time with us. We are sure that by participating in this session, you have gained some useful knowledge. We look forward to your active participation in future as well. We also thank our motivated and dedicated colleague in CUTS to provide your logistic support to organize this important webinar successfully. So finally, once again, I want to state that we are most grateful to all our speakers on this session. We all are inspired by your great words today. We thank you for being with us, and it has been a great pleasure for all of us. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Aman. Before we disperse, I request all the speakers to switch on the video. We will take a screenshot before we close this webinar. Amar also to remain. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thanks once again. Thanks to all the speakers and the participants. We end this webinar. Thank you.